Hi, boys and girls. Today I am reading, let me shift over. Today I am reading chapter 8 of Time for Andrew. So here we go. Chapter 8. Late in the afternoon, I woke up to see a tall man standing beside the bed. He wore a rumpled white suit. His hair was thick and dark, his bearded face stern. Forgetting where I was, I cowered under the quilt. "Who are you?" I cried. "What do you want?" The man drew back in surprise. "Who the Sam Hill do you think I am?" Hannah leapt from the rocking chair and ran to the bed, clasping my hands. She said, "Don't be frightened, Andrew. It's Papa, just Papa." "Papa," I repeated. "Papa." My heart was pounding so loud I thought everyone would hear it. "He was sound asleep," Hannah said to her father. "You startled him." While Hannah searched for ways to explain my behavior, I tried to breathe normally. Nothing had changed. I was still in Andrew's bed. The man was his father. I should have recognized him from the pictures Aunt Blythe had shown me. Mrs. Tyler appeared in the doorway. "I heard Andrew cry out," she said. "Is something wrong?" "The boy didn't know me," Mr. Tyler said. "My own son was afraid of me." Mrs. Tyler squeezed her husband's arm. "Don't worry, Henry. The fever has left Andrew weak, easily confused, forgetful. Dr. Fulton assures me a little rest is all he needs." Mr. Tyler wasn't so sure. "There's something different about him. His eyes." The sentence trailed off into uncertainty, and he turned away. Mrs. Tyler followed him, but Hannah lingered. "I'll bring a tray up later," she promised. "I hope you're hungry. Mama fixed roast chicken especially for you." Giving me a quick kiss, she left the room. Hours later, I eased out of bed. The hall clock was chiming midnight. In the woods behind the house, frogs croaked and crickets chirped. Otherwise, there was no sound. Wrapped in blankets of silence, the house slept. I tiptoed slowly up the attic steps. At the top, I peered into the darkness, hoping to see Andrew. There was no sign of him. I was alone. "Andrew?" I whispered. "Andrew?" No one answered. I waited a few seconds and called him again, a little louder this time. An owl hooted. Mice rustled under the eaves. Buster barked, but Andrew didn't come. Afraid of waking the Tylers, I crept back down the stairs. From their round frame, the three horses watched me crawl into bed. Pulling the quilt over my head, I cried myself to sleep. Several days later, Dr. Fulton dropped by for another visit. He took my pulse and my temperature. He examined my throat, my ears, my nose. He listened solemnly to my chest. "Fresh air is what you need, my boy," he said. I shook my head. But my protests did no good. In seconds, Mrs. Tyler had my nightshirt off. Sitting me up, she dressed me as if I were a floppy rag doll, too weak to do anything for myself. Once my shoes were laced and tied, Mrs. Tyler put her hands on my shoulders to steady me. "Are you strong enough to walk?" I gripped the banister and started slowly down the steps. Mrs. Tyler hovered by my side, but Dr. Fulton assured her I was fit as a fiddle. "Don't mollycoddle him, Mildred. You'll spoil him." In the hall, I glimpsed a boy in the mirror. He wore a baggy white shirt and knee-length pants. For a moment, I wasn't sure whose reflection it was, mine or Andrew's. Dr. Fulton opened the screen door and ushered me to the swing. "Take a seat right there, Andrew." Without thinking, I said, "Everything looks so nice. You painted the porch and cut the grass. The ivy's gone. Somebody trimmed the wisteria. But the highway, the cars..." Mrs. Tyler and Dr. Fulton were staring at me, their faces puzzled. I shut my eyes. Just as I feared, I'd given myself away. The swing creaked as Mrs. Tyler sank down beside me, pulling me close. She whispered, "It's all right, dear. Things look different when you've been away from them for a short time." Dr. Fulton cleared his throat. "I don't know what you're up to, Andrew, but I won't have you teasing your mother. You've caused her enough worry as it is." I wasn't teasing. Scared to look at him, I stared at the stiff, shiny shoes on my feet. Andrew's, of course. I'd seen them in his photograph. Dr. Fulton regarded me solemnly. "Rest," he said, "and get plenty of fresh air. Eat wholesome food, drink milk, take your tonic, and behave yourself. After the doctor left, Mrs. Tyler went into the house. In a few moments, Hannah came outside carrying a tray. Milk and cookies for the convalescent, she said, and the latest adventure of Frank Merriwell. Hannah put the tray on the table and sat down in the swing beside me. Opening Tip Top Weekly, she began to read aloud. I'd already heard 3 stories about Frank. In each one, he was challenged to perform a courageous deed, but I always fell asleep before he accomplished it. As a hero, he was just a little too good to be interesting. There was excitement at Yale, Hannah began. The sensation of the winter season had been the result of the glove fight between Bart Hodge and Buck Badger. No one had seemed to dream that Hodge could whip Badger, for the Canson had shown that he was a great fighter, and Bart had been defeated by him in a bare fistfight the previous fall. As Hannah warmed to the story, her voice rose and grew more animated. I owe it all to Merriwell, she read, giving the speaker an appropriate Southern accent. He taught me, gentlemen, that a man can be a man without always carrying a chip on his shoulder. He taught me that a man can preserve his dignity without compelling every weaker man to bow to him in humbleness. But I know that he can fight when pushed to it. Sorry, boys and girls, my Southern accent didn't come out this time. I'll try again later. Looking up from the page, Hannah sighed. Isn't that grand, Andrew? What a gentleman Frank is. What a lofty mind he has. Someday I hope to marry someone just like him. Trouble is, most boys around here just don't amount to shucks. She was interrupted by a shout. Theo was running up the hill toward the house. With him was another boy, a head taller, long-legged as a greyhound. Oh, Jove, Hannah muttered. Here comes Edward, the very antithesis of Frank Merriwell. I opened my mouth to ask who Edward was, but Buster stopped me just in time. Racing ahead of Theo and Edward, the big black dog bounded eagerly up the steps. When he was close enough to smell, he froze. Slowly, his hackles rose. Curling his lip to expose his big, sharp teeth, he growled. Sure, he was going to bite me. I scooted to a corner of the swing and crouched there, taking care to keep my feet out of his reach. Get him away from me, I yelled. Get him away! Buster! Hannah swatted him with the Tip Top Weekly. Bad dog! Theo grabbed Buster's collar. What's wrong? He cried. I brought him to see you, Andrew. I thought you'd be glad. He doesn't look very glad. Edward leaned against the banister, grinning as if Buster's behavior amused him. Neither does the dog, for that matter. Ignoring Edward, Theo murmured in Buster's ear, petted him, coaxed him to be quiet, but the dog continued to growl and then to bark. Unlike everybody else, he wasn't fooled by appearances. He knew an imposter when he smelled one. Exasperated, Hannah told Theo to take Buster away. I don't know what ails that stupid dog. You'd think he never saw Andrew before. When Theo was out of sight, Hannah scowled at Edward. To what do we owe the honor of your company? Her voice was cold enough to freeze Niagara Falls, but Edward simply shrugged. Since when is it a crime to visit the sick? Turning to me, he said, From the way people talked, I thought you'd be dead and buried by now. I should have known it was too good to be true. Although Edward made the remark sound like a joke, it was obvious he didn't like me any more than my old enemy Martin did. It was disappointing to realize you weren't safe from bullies no matter where or when you were. I glanced at Hannah, but she was twisting a tendril of wisteria around one finger, giving it all her attention. Behind her, the purple flowers buzzed with bees. Edward leaned toward me, waiting for me to say something. Instead, I inched closer to Hannah. I was on stage, the curtain was up, the audience was watching, but I was speechless, just as I'd feared. I'd have to bluff my way through the entire performance. Theo came back and broke the silence, wedging himself into the swing between his sister and me. He said, I hope Buster doesn't have distemper. Maybe he's caught whatever Andrew has. Edward stared at me from under lowered eyelids. You seem a little strange, too. Not quite yourself yet. Hannah put her arm around me. Andrew's fine. The fever left him a little weak, that's all. Weak in the head, Edward added, like poor old George Foster. If you're going to insult my brother, you can take yourself off that railing and out of my sight. Edward ignored Hannah. Maybe we should give Andrew a little test just to make sure the fever didn't damage his brain. Don't be silly. Hannah tapped the rolled magazine to her knee as if she wanted to whack Edward even harder than she'd whacked Buster. Looking at me, Edward went on with his game. We'll start with easy questions. What year is it? Hannah protested, but I answered anyway. 1910. Edward pressed on. Who's the president? For heaven's sake, Hannah said. Stop tormenting him, Edward. 1910. Who was president in 1910? Dates, names, and faces tumbled through my head. Ulysses S. Grant? Woodrow Wilson? Chester Arthur? Arthur Chester? Teddy Roosevelt? I'd memorized the presidents for my 5th grade teacher, but I couldn't remember them now. It's William Howard Taft, Theo shouted. Everybody knows that. Andrew didn't, Edward said. Of course he did, Hannah patted my hand. He's tired, that's all. Refusing to give up, Edward folded his arms across his chest and grinned at me. Let's see if you can answer this one. How many states are there? Without thinking, I said 50. Didn't I tell you he was touched in the head? Edward laughed. Even George Foster knows there's only 46 states. Hannah hurled the magazine at him. That's enough, Edward. You know how sick Andrew's been. Lord, he was like to die. Backing away, Edward laughed. Don't get so riled up, Hannah. I was just teasing. To prove it, he leapt off the railing and pulled me out of the swing. Slinging one arm around my shoulders, he squeezed so hard I was sure I heard my bones crack. You can take a joke, can't you, Andrew? Before I could do more than gasp, Edward released me. Mrs. Tyler was standing in the doorway, frowning at him. Good afternoon, Aunt Mildred, Edward said with oily politeness. I just stopped in to pay my respects to Andrew. I'd best be going now. We watched him lope across the grass and vanish into the trees at the bottom of the hill. Good riddance, Mrs. Tyler muttered, to no one in particular. To me, she said, come inside and rest. From the looks of you, Edward wore you out. To Theo's amazement, I was allowed to lie down on the parlor sofa. Today is special, Mrs. Tyler said. Andrew's out of bed and on the mend. There's no sense in making him climb all the way upstairs just to have a nap. Herding Theo ahead of her and beckoning to Hannah, Mrs. Tyler left me alone to rest. The shutters were closed, the room was dim. Things I had once seen in the attic peered at me from the shadows. A stuffed pheasant under a clear dome, a pair of landscape paintings, a small organ, a glass-fronted bookcase. The hall clock ticked steadily. Insects hummed and buzzed. A mourning dove cooed sadly. Drowsy sounds, soothing, quiet, soft, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Edward's face. He'd called Mrs. Tyler Aunt Mildred. That meant he was Andrew's cousin. But who was he to me? Who do you think? The heat and the monotonous ticking of the clock dulled my mind, made it hard to remember what Aunt Blythe had told me. My thoughts strayed. I found myself searching for faces in the flowered wallpaper. A young girl in a rose, an old man in a bunch of leaves. Like optical illusions, they shifted and changed, appeared and disappeared. The young girl became an old woman, the old man became a boy. Closing my eyes, I sank into a deep sleep. All right, boys and girls, so we just met Cousin Edward. I want you to think about who that might be in relation to Andrew. Well, we know to Andrew it's the cousin, but who is it in relation to Drew or even to Aunt Mildred? Or not Aunt Mildred, Aunt Blythe. All right, boys and girls, I'll see you tomorrow for Chapter 9. Have a great day.